But first, pot goes legal in Canada in just 5 weeks, and we now know what guards at the U.S. border will tolerate from Canadians who have any connection to recreational marijuana. In short, not much. Politico Canada's Luiza Savage broke the story after talking to a senior official in border operations. She joins us from Washington. All right, Luiza, give us the bad news. What's it going to look like for Canadians going from a pot legal country into the United States starting on October 17th?
Well, according to the most senior official at the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Don, this is a really big deal. They have laws on the books that treat drug users, drug traffickers, and anyone who facilitates drug trafficking, that would include investors, that consider them inadmissible. And this is not going to change. And this is what they told me on the record, what it'll mean for Canadians crossing into the United States. It will mean that if there's any suspicion that you have drugs in your car, if there's a smell coming out of your car, for example, or dogs can detect residue up to 2 weeks later, you will be asked whether you've used marijuana. They won't ask that of everyone, but if there's a clue, they may follow up on it. And that will mean, first of all, you can be prosecuted. And if authorities don't prosecute you, they will, CBP will levy a fine of up to $5,000. But more importantly, if they ask you what you do for a living and you say that you work for a marijuana company, you will be deemed inadmissible into the United States. And that means you're basically banned for life. You'll have to apply for a special waiver that costs $585 US. It can take up to 6 months, and it's at the pure discretion of the US government whether they give you that waiver. So if your work depends on coming into the United States, that's a really big deal. And then thirdly, the same thing applies for investors. If you are an investor in the marijuana industry, you can also face a lifetime ban. And the official that I spoke to for my story at Politico Pro Canada said they've actually done this to investors from Israel who have been denied entry into the United States already. And we've heard some anecdotal stories, of course, of cannabis workers from Canada being turned back at the border and being told they can't enter. So what this top official, Todd Owen, told me was that these are laws that have long been on the books, and they are not going to change just because Canada is legalizing. And they apply even though there are some states here that allow marijuana use. Even if you're crossing into, say, Washington states, it doesn't matter because the border between the U.S. and Canada is governed by federal law, and marijuana remains strictly prohibited by U.S. federal law.
Right. Well, we always knew that was sort of the case for smoking or being caught in possession, but I guess this is a whole new series of categories if you're a retail worker or in a government cannabis store or whatever. And I'm curious, how on earth would they find out if you're an investor? Because there's millions of Canadians that have never used the stuff that are making a mint on the stock market these days for investing in, the canopy growths of the world here.
Right. And I asked Todd Owen, who's responsible for border operations at CBP, is there a threshold, a minimum threshold for investment before you consider this a problem? And he didn't give him a minimum threshold. He just said that facilitating the marijuana business, whether it's in Canada or in the United States, can make you inadmissible. In terms of the way they're going to question people, they're not going to ask every Canadian traveler, hey, have you ever used marijuana? Do you invest in marijuana? They're not going out of their way to do that. It's more an issue of where the questioning leads them. So if they have reason to suspect that you've been using marijuana or have it in your car, or they ask you what you do for a living, or why are you coming into the United States, if any of those paths of questioning lead them to this information, you could risk being deemed inadmissible for life to the United States. So, there's a lot of liberties that border officials can take, a lot more in the United States than in Canada in terms of searches and questioning. So it's just something that could come up. They're not going to ask every single Canadian coming across the border, have you invested in marijuana stocks? But I think it's important for people to know that if this comes up, there are some serious consequences. And this is the first time we've had the most senior official in charge of operations kind of detail what this will look like and the steps that they'll be taking. So that's all in my story that I hope you'll check out on Politico Pro Canada. We just launched yesterday, and this is the kind of in-depth Canada-U.S. Policy coverage that we'll be offering.
All right, Luiza, there's going to be a lot of lying at the border in the future. I can see that. Thanks very much for joining us, and congratulations on getting the service up and running.